Hello and welcome back to Cult Leader. I'm your cult leader, Spencer Henry, and today we're talking about gay porn. No, really, we're talking about gay porn today. That's the theme of the episode, you might say, and believe it or not, it's something that I've come across. I've encountered a gay porn website or two in my lifetime. I know, shocking. You look at me and you think, this guy. Now, gay porn is probably on the rise anyway. What with that hockey show? What is it? Heated Rivalry? Oh, people are probably cranking their hogs and flicking their beans to gay porn left and right now. So what better time than to talk about this extremely chaotic story in the gay porn universe? When I heard about this case, I was like, okay, I need to get to the bottom of it because there's nothing I love more than being on top of a case. All right, now come back with me. It was a cold winter night in Dallas Township, Pennsylvania on January 24th of 2007. But a 911 call placed just after 8:30 p.m. was about to turn up the heat. Literally. The call claimed there was a fire at a house on Midland Drive. The neighbor said it looked bad, like flames were pouring out of the front door. The whole front of the house was just fucking lighting up, okay? It's insane. And Dallas Township is a small, sleepy town, so it relied on volunteer firefighters, and that night, some of them were already together for a training session less than a tenth of a mile away. What are the chances? So they were on the scene almost immediately, and within minutes, trucks were rolling down the street to this house. Now, when they show up, they immediately notice that the fire was aggressive in a way that didn't quite make sense. For a residential house fire in a quiet neighborhood, it was burning very quickly and at a very high temperature. Flames were raging through the front door and windows, especially this one large bay window that was in front of the house. It faced the street, okay? And then they saw that the front door had been left wide open, causing the oxygen coming in from the opening to feed the fire, essentially, making it just burn like crazy. Once firefighters knocked the flames down enough to be able to get inside of the house was already charred to ashes and blacked out with smoke. They were looking for anyone that had been in the house, hoping that it was empty. But that's when they found the body. It was lying on a couch inside the living room and was burned so badly, there was no immediate way to tell who it was whatsoever. Nothing recognizable. And at first glance, it looked like this tragic but straightforward fire death. But things just didn't sit right. Something was off. Like, first of all, the front door being wide open, right? But the body being on the couch, that sets off some alarms. Smoke detectors were found removed from their mounts and tossed onto the floor in the house. Hello, big red flag. And that wasn't something a fire did on its own, okay? It's not like, okay, quit chiming at me. We hear you, right? Firefighters stopped moving things around and backed off because they realized this wasn't just a fire emergency anymore. It was time to bring in the authorities. When word reached law enforcement, even seasoned officers knew that something was wrong. By morning, Dallas Township woke up to the news. A house had been burned on Midland Drive. A body found inside, and it was pretty clear that this was no accident. The rumors started spreading as fast as the fire, baby. Something unthinkable happened in a place where things like this don't happen at all, right? It was apparently a moida. So who was the burned body on the couch, and whose house was it anyway? Well, his name was Bryan Kocis. He'd lived on Midland Drive for years, long enough that most of his neighbors recognized him. He had a little bit of a reputation, which we'll get to later on, but no one really could say that they knew him. He wasn't the type to hang around chatting over the fences or hosting backyard cookouts. He wasn't at the block party. He mostly just kept to himself. Bryan had grown up in northeastern Pennsylvania, not far from where he eventually passed away. And by most accounts, his early life looked pretty solid on paper. He was an Eagle Scout, smart guy, good with technology, had a real talent for photography, especially the kind that required precision and patience. After high school, he went on to study photography more formally and eventually built this career as a medical photographer working for an eye doctor. It was very specialized work that required skill with lighting, cameras, and attention to detail, and he was good at it. But he wasn't inspired by it. It was hard to be. Bryan had a lot of frustration simmering under the surface. He was very ambitious and wanted more than what his life seemed to be giving him at the time. More. He wanted more. He bounced through a few different business ideas that never really worked out. And over time, the money problems started to pile up, followed by debt. By the early 2000s, things had gotten really bad. Bad enough that Bryan actually filed for bankruptcy during this time. Like so many other lonely people, that isolation pushed him online. And soon the internet became both a refuge and an opportunity. It was a place where he could be anonymous, right? He could experiment and rebuild himself without having to explain anything to the people around him. He could reinvent his whole life. So out of his basement, he created his own adult video production studio called Cobra Video. And at first, it was small and scrappy, low overhead, very amateur looking by design, not the high production quality that bigger studios were putting out at the time. His videos looked raw and authentic. Yeah, I had to investigate, okay? Bryan controlled everything from the casting and filming to editing and distribution. He didn't answer to anyone. Early on, Cobra was just another corner of the gay adult industry. Got some good views, started to gather some dedicated fans, but then something clicked. Bryan figured out a formula, a sort of niche, where Cobra's focus turned to young-looking men, the boy next door type, clean cut, soft features, guys who were technically adults but didn't necessarily look like it. Twinks. And that was Bryan's type, so he knew there was a market for it. He liked them to look young. A line that got him into some hot water not long before starting Cobra Video, because in 2001, police had actually searched Bryan's house after discovering that he was in contact online with a teenage boy. And inside of his house, they found a videotape involving a 15-year-old. The charges were very serious at first, the kind that could have ended life as he knew it, really. But the case unraveled. The boy admitted to authorities that he had lied about his age and refused to testify against Bryan. Thus, Bryan pleaded guilty to a reduced charge, and he was able to actually avoid prison time and being put on some crazy list, receiving probation instead. Even with that brush with the law, he leaned hard into that image, that niche. He basically branded Cobra around youth and innocence while pushing boundaries that other studios completely avoided, like shooting bareback, where they're not wearing condoms. And that was very controversial even then. It was risky, it was taboo, and it was, above all else, lucrative. Mainstream studios stayed away from it, but Bryan wasn't answering to anyone but himself. That decision alone made Cobra an outlier. It also made Bryan something of a pariah in the industry. He wasn't invited into the inner circles of the industry. He wasn't respected in polite company. He didn't get glowing journalistic reviews, but he didn't care because the money was all he needed, and it was coming in. The audience wanted to see those cum shots, and the videos of bareback twink hot loads were selling like hotcakes. And when the cash ship finally came in, it came in hard, wet, and fast. Suddenly, Bryan wasn't the guy drowning in debt anymore. He wasn't some small town loser. He was driving expensive cars, multiple expensive cars. He bought property. He had cash to burn, baby. From the outside, his house still looked quiet and rather ordinary. He wasn't risking any cops sniffing around again, but behind those drawn shades was a business that was pulling in serious money. He was sort of living a double life at that point. Bryan became very secretive, very guarded. To his neighbors, he was still just the odd guy on the street who kept strange hours. The one with a garage full of luxury cars that didn't quite match the neighborhood. But it was hard not to notice that from time to time, maybe a time too many, he had young men coming and going from his house on a regular basis. But don't worry, after that first incident, he was checking IDs. He was not going to make that mistake again of messing around with these young guys. And so one of those boys visiting happened to be the right one at the right time and was about to change everything for Cobra Video, his little porn studio. His name was Brent Corrigan. Well, sort of. His real name was Sean Lockhart. And at the time Bryan met him, Brent Corrigan didn't really exist yet. When Bryan met him online, which is how the two of them came into contact, it was sometime around 2004, back when IM, instant messages, and webcams were still the main way that people connected with each other. What Bryan saw from the pictures and profile was this 18-year-old SoCal kid. He was young looking, he was a pretty boy, but clearly needed something. Attention. Money, stability, probably all of it. They started chatting the way a lot of people did in the early 2000s. Very casual at first, and then more and more often. Late nights, long conversations, not just about sex and porn. Bryan was encouraging to Brent. He made promises that sounded like once-in-a-lifetime opportunities, offering mentorship to help him learn more about how to make films. Because Brent is his stage name, it's just how we're going to refer to him throughout the rest of the episode. So Brent didn't come from the most steady background. Home had never really felt solid, and by the time that Bryan entered the picture, he was already used to fending for himself. He was working a lot of minimum wage jobs, just trying to get by. So when this older guy comes around with all this money and experience and confidence and started paying attention to Brent, like really paying attention, it mattered. He was basically grooming him, for all intents and purposes. And eventually the conversations turned into Brent filming with Cobra. He would travel to select locations while still very young and lying to his friends and family, of course, about where he was going. And that's when he started making the transformation from Sean Lockhart to Brent Corrigan. After filming, Bryan immediately knew he had found something special. Someone special. On camera, Brent had that look that hit exactly what Cobra's audience wanted. Twink, through and through. He looked impossibly young, but confident. Bryan checked his ID several times to make sure he was of legal age. Very innocent and sexual at the same time. Even the name Brent Corrigan sounded clean, right? It's all American, it's memorable, it's Brent Corrigan. By 2004, Brent was everywhere within that niche of the gay porn industry. One of his films became the most downloaded gay porn title of the year, and fans were addicted. Brent Corrigan went from being a nobody to one of the most talked about performers in that niche almost overnight. He was Cobra's golden ticket, and Bryan knew it too. He wasn't about to let him go back to California. As Brent's popularity exploded, Bryan's emotional and financial dependence on him grew right alongside it. Cobra's biggest sales revolved around Brent, so Bryan's lifestyle, the cars, the property, the money, all depended on him keeping his star close and in demand. And Bryan didn't just act like a boss. He acted like a handler mixed with a sugar daddy, a very familiar relationship in that world. Basically, he treated Brent like he owned him and the entire situation. The power imbalance was very clear, very obvious. Bryan was older, wealthier, and in control of all of the contracts, while Brent was still young, isolated from home, and still figuring out who he even was at the core of it all. Bryan showered him with gifts, promised bigger and better things were on the horizon, talked all about the future they could build together. And there were stretches where Brent was living under Bryan's roof, on Bryan's terms, of course. But everything really started revolving around Cobra Studios. Brent started looking around at the life Bryan was living while he was basically living like a pool boy. He started seeing things differently. If Brent was the star, the main moneymaker, why was he still depending on Bryan? Why was Bryan buying cars and Rolexes while Brent was still only making a couple of grand a video? Which was, to be fair, very well compensated at the time. But eventually the tension and resentment boiled over, and Brent wanted out from under Bryan's thumb. He wanted independence. He wanted more career and creative control, and the ability to work without Bryan hovering over every single decision. And that's when everything started to unravel. The adult film industry is like a lot of other jobs. It's pretty much they're all the same, right? Any sort of entertainment job, you get roped into contracts, you get fed all of these promises, you get all these people coming in. Like when you're hot, right? And they're like, okay, we're gonna offer you this, we want you to do this. And then you do realize at a certain point, like, oh, all of these people are profiting off of me. And that is what is happening here, is like we have this very young, impressionable kid, but then he realized he knew how big his star power was starting to become. And so I think he just had that moment of clarity where he's like, I'm the reason that money is coming in right now. And granted, Bryan's the one who found him and kind of molded him into this adult film star. But by doing so, he opened up Pandora's box, right? Because Brent started getting introduced to all of these other people in the industry, and they're all like, oh my God, like, you're a star, you're a star. And he's like, well, yeah, I am a fucking star, actually. And if I'm a star, why am I making this when I know that based on subscribers and downloads and everything, Brian's just fucking raking it all in, right? It doesn't make sense. By 2005, Brent had found a new partner and wanted to officially move away from Cobra. But there was a problem. He didn't read his contract thoroughly. Turns out he couldn't just up and leave Cobra and go be Brent Corrigan somewhere else, because he didn't even own his own name. Brian did. Yeah, Brian wasn't taking any chances on losing his main product. He was smart. He knew how to protect himself. Once Brent started to see some real success and a growing fan base, Brian trademarked the name, meaning that Sean Lockhart couldn't perform under his stage name. And you're probably like, okay, change your name. Same face, same body, same dick. Sean thought this too. He tried to get contracted under other names, but producers weren't buying it. They wanted Brent Corrigan. They wanted the name. They wanted the brand. They wanted the built-in fan base. The clickbait, not some newcomer who was starting over. And this became a really, really big problem. So then it slipped, a bombshell. It came out that Brent had actually been underage when some of his earliest Cobra films were shot. He was just 17 at the time and had shown Brian a fake ID. That means technically it was child pornography, and everyone involved panicked. Titles were immediately pulled from the site. People who bought the films were like, oh God, I don't want this, right? And then probably some sickos were like, great. But what followed was an ugly and public feud. Lawsuits flew back and forth, and the blogs at the time lit up. Industry forums picked sides, and every move was dissected online in the fandoms, in these little forums. Brian, who had always operated quietly and behind the scenes, found himself under siege. His business was threatened and his star was slipping away. And the world that he had built was in jeopardy of crumbling down. But he wasn't backing down. Around this same time, the mid-2000s, the story shifts away from Pennsylvania. Not to Hollywood, though, not to some big porn studio in Los Angeles. Instead, it jumps about 300 miles south to Virginia Beach, Virginia. A military town, strip malls, subdivisions, fighter jets screaming overhead. Very different from Dallas Township, but still a place where people lived pretty ordinary lives on the surface. This is where Harlow Quadra and Joseph Karakees come in. They were a hot and heavy couple, and business partners. Like Brian and Sean, they had met online, and Harlow had grown up bouncing around Florida and South Carolina with the accent to match, and eventually joined the Navy. He was this clean-cut, apple-cheeked, polo-wearing kid in a bow tie. After a back injury and an honorable discharge, he found himself in Virginia Beach without much of a plan, but with something he knew people would pay for: his body. He had a body. Okay. Joe's background, however, looked completely different. He grew up in Virginia Beach in a deeply religious Christian household. He was smart, articulate, and for a while he even worked as a youth pastor at a megachurch in the area. He was also a Marine. But Joe had a temper on him. Eventually, he washed out of the church and then out of the Marines, and what came next was a sharp left turn for a man of that background. Joe got into escorting. By the early 2000s, escorting wasn't exactly hidden anymore. It was online, organized, and surprisingly profitable if you knew how to work it. Joe didn't just work as an escort himself, he managed others. He built their websites, took booking calls, handled scheduling, and Harlow became one of his top earners. Together, they built and ran an escort operation that catered to a lot of different military guys, a lot of closeted men, and anyone else that was willing to pay the price for it. And they started raking it in too. Money was real. And along with it came this lifestyle that both men had dreamed of. They bought this big house in a new development, drove expensive cars, wore Rolexes, ate out at fancy, trendy restaurants constantly. And from the outside, it looked like they had reached just the pinnacle of success. But underneath, they were spending the money a lot faster than they made it, and they were drowning in debt. Credit cards, loans, leases, you name it. And by the mid-2000s, they were carrying close to $1 million in debt. everything that they had built on cash flow that could disappear at any moment. And that's where porn came in. Escorting paid the bills, but porn looked like legitimacy. Something bigger, something scalable. There was a lot more control there and a much more steady revenue stream. They could reach a much bigger audience. They had seen how successful competitors like Cobra Video and other online distributors at the time were, and they wanted a piece of the porn pie. Harlow had what it took to be a star in the industry. He was muscular, good-looking, well-endowed, and already filming bareback porn on a small military-themed website they ran called Boy Batter. But they didn't want to stay on the margins forever. They wanted a breakout star, a real name working with them, someone who could pull them out of the escorting world and lead them to the top of the adult industry for real and for good. And there was one name on everybody's lips at the time: Brent Corrigan. Even after the lawsuits and pulled titles, his name still carried heavy weight in the industry. His videos still did numbers, and fans would follow him to whatever site or studio that he went to. He was literally a fan favorite. To Harlow and Joe, he looked like the key to everything that they wanted: money, status, a way out of this deepening hole they'd created. So they did what everyone in this story seemed to do when they wanted something badly enough. They went online. They started sending emails, messages, casual check-ins on Messengers and MySpace. Nothing too serious or aggressive at the beginning. Just like, hey, we'd love to meet you. We'd love to hang out. Harlow played it cool and made it sound like, this is a great opportunity for collaboration. We know you're not working with Cobra anymore. It was a fresh start with no drama and no lawsuits, just money and control on Brent's terms. No baggage. At least that was the initial pitch. By this point, Brent wasn't operating alone anymore. He was living in San Diego, California with his boyfriend at the time, Grant Roy. He was a trucking executive from Texas who had both money and ambition of his own. Grant had taken over the business side of Sean or Brent's life, from managing deals, fielding offers, to helping with the lawsuits and trying to turn Brent Corrigan back into something more than just a stage name that other people were profiting from. But things were really tricky with the whole trademarking thing, and it was getting harder for Brent to find work. So when Harlow and Joe showed up, started talking about partnering up, it wasn't long before he took them up on their offer of a meeting. They all agreed to meet in person in January 2007 in Las Vegas during the annual Adult Videos News Convention, AVN. AVN was the porn industry's biggest event of the year. Studios, performers, agents, producers, everyone showed up like it was the porn Emmys. Also great for networking. Deals were often made over drinks and late dinners. If you wanted to be taken seriously in porn, this is where you went. On January 11th of 2007, the four of them sat down for dinner at Le Cirque inside the Bellagio, and it was an expensive dinner. It was loud, flashy, just the kind of place where big ideas felt even bigger after a few Vegas-strength cocktails, baby. Harlow and Joe started throwing out numbers, and they floated the idea of paying Brent tens of thousands of dollars per film, way more than he'd ever made per scene before. They talked about building a studio around him, about finally cashing in on his name without answering to anyone else. And it all sounded impressive, almost too impressive. There was an obvious problem here, right? A problem sitting at the table that nobody could really ignore: Bryan Kocis. Sean Lockhart couldn't perform as Brent Corrigan, and Harlow and Joe really wanted that name attached. As long as Bryan was still tied up legally with Sean and still fighting over the Brent Corrigan name, any big plans were stuck. Everyone at the table knew it. And that's when the conversation took a turn. At some point over dinner, Harlow started throwing out hypotheticals. Casual, almost joking. Like, what if Bryan just went away for a while? What if he left the country? What if he went somewhere else? Brent, who had been throwing him back that night, didn't really register where the questions were going. So he brushed it off like, yeah, right. Bryan would come right back, he said. And then the questions started to get a little more specific. What if Bryan went to Canada and didn't come back, huh? That one landed different. They changed the subject. And at the time, it was easy to tell yourself it was just drunk talk, right? Big mouths at a big dinner, fueled up by money and ego and alcohol. Nobody stood up, nobody left, nobody called the police like, oh, they just said this. The night just moved on. At the time, it was just a strange moment in a long, over-the-top dinner in Las Vegas. No one at the table knew, or at least admitted, that they might be serious about this. By the time January 24th, 2007 rolled around, Bryan Kocis thought he was finally getting his footing back. He had spent most of the day inside his house, curtains drawn like always, his phone glued to his ear. He was calling his lawyer, talking to his distributor, going over details again and again and again. The legal fight with Sean was basically over and the settlement was nearing complete. It wasn't perfect, but it was survivable. From Bryan's perspective, it was going to be all right. The lawsuits had been draining financially, emotionally, reputationally, and Cobra Video had taken hits, but it hadn't collapsed. Bryan still very much had control of his business, of his studio. He still had his house, he still had money coming in, and now finally it looked like he might be able to move forward without this Brent Corrigan drama hanging over everything. That same day, something else landed in his inbox. A new model application. Perfect timing. The name on it was Danny. The photo showed a young-looking guy, clean-cut, fresh-faced, the kind of look that Bryan's audience responded to. The application sounded eager, nervous even. Danny said he didn't have much experience and that he might need to be taught. That line especially caught Bryan's attention. He's like, I think I can arrange something or rearrange your guts. Emails went back and forth throughout the day. He asked questions. Danny answered them. Danny said he was nearby, but said he could come over that night and asked if they could just meet alone, just the two of them at least the first time. And Bryan agreed. He invited Danny to his house and told him to bring his things with him, suggesting that he could spend the night if things went well. And this wasn't unusual for Bryan. That was how Cobra Studios often worked. It was very informal, private, controlled entirely by him. That's how he got Sean Lockhart, Brent Corrigan. By early evening, Bryan started wrapping up his calls. The business side of his life was, for that moment, settled, and the future didn't look so bad. When Danny arrived that evening, Bryan let him in. And from that point on, no one knows exactly what happened inside the house when Danny arrived. But we know that Danny was let inside without any struggle. We know that Bryan opened a bottle of wine at some point, and that their meeting didn't last long. Less than 2 hours from arrival to the fire being reported. Everything else we know comes from the aftermath of that evening, from evidence. Whatever happened that night, Bryan didn't see coming. His body had been stabbed. A lot, dozens of times. His throat had been slashed so deeply, it was nearly a decapitation. By the time the fire was set, Bryan was already very much deceased. The fire was just an attempt to cover up and erase what had happened. Because that'll do it. But the name Danny would start to unravel into something else entirely, too. Almost immediately, rumors started circulating. Some people wondered if this was a serial killer passing through the area. Others pointed fingers at Bryan's past. His arrest from years earlier. Maybe this was a revenge thing. Maybe it was karma. Once questions started about the young men who had been coming and going from Bryan's house for years, the porn business, the lawsuits, obviously Sean Lockhart's name came up. So did Grant Roy's. They were already public figures within the world and already controversial. To some people, the motive seemed obvious. Money. Control, revenge. Law enforcement started to look at everything inside the house that hadn't been completely destroyed or engulfed in flames. Some of Bryan's computer equipment was damaged, but parts of it were able to be recovered. Emails were pulled, files reconstructed, and among them were messages from the last day of Bryan's life, including all of those emails with Danny. Photos attached. They were able to trace the model application that had come through Cobra's website through the IP addresses. Police released one of the photos publicly, and he was recognized almost immediately. It didn't take some elite task force or secret database. The identification came from the same place so much of his story had lived all along. The internet. People in the adult industry knew that face. Escorts recognized him. Fans did too. And who was it? Ding, ding, ding. Harlow Quadra. He wasn't a naive new model, he wasn't a local, and he definitely wasn't named Danny. And once his name was out there, they officially had their suspect. Investigators quickly traced him back to Virginia Beach, and that's where the hunt really began. In early February of 2007, police coordinated with local authorities and federal agencies and moved in hard, fast, and in uniform. SWAT showed up at the house that Harlow shared with Joe in the early morning. Yelling, tactical gear, the whole thing. The whole block knew some serious shit was going down, okay? Oh, if Nextdoor had been operable back then, game over. They would have broke the internet. SWAT bust in and the house is empty. There's no Harlow. There's no Joe. The power couple was gone. But in their rush to disappear, they hadn't exactly cleaned up after themselves. Inside the house, police found items that raised eyebrows immediately. We're talking dumbass criminal behavior. Okay, they left video equipment that looked a lot like what had been reported missing from Bryan's house. Cameras, gear, things that should not have been there. And that's when investigators stopped wondering if they were involved and started figuring out how they were involved. Instead, why they were involved. And honestly, the deeper they dug, the worse it looked. Cell phone records showed pings placing Harlow and Joe exactly where they shouldn't have been in the days leading up to the murder. A rental car had been taken out and logged mileage that lined up perfectly with a drive from Virginia Beach to northeastern Pennsylvania and back. Hotel receipts put them at a motel less than 15 minutes from Bryan's house on the night of January 24th. Come on, you guys. Not a brain cell between the two of them. And then there was the pawn shop. Surveillance footage showed Harlow and Joe walking into a pawn shop in Virginia Beach just before the trip up north. They had bought a lock blade knife, the same type later found at the crime scene, and they also appeared to have bought a gun, even though it evidently was not used. Because these guys were apparently not criminal masterminds, they paid with traceable credit cards. Of course, every step they even left a fucking paper trail for them. At this point, investigators were more than confident they knew who had done it. What they needed now was something cleaner, something undeniable. Words, maybe. Admissions. And that's where they would have to tap into Sean Lockhart, aka Brent Corrigan, and Grant Roy, his boyfriend. They needed to bring them back into the picture. After Bryan's murder, Sean and Grant had been living under a microscope themselves, and they knew it. Everybody knew it. The blogs, everyone was saying, what if Brent Corrigan was behind this? So when investigators approached them with an idea, it was risky, but also offered a way to completely clear their names. The idea was simple and insane at the same time, honestly. Grant and Sean would meet up with Harlow and Joe again, act like business was still on the table, and let them talk. They agreed to meet at a nude beach outside San Diego where Sean and Grant were living at the time. Harlow had suggested the location himself. He seemed to think that being naked meant being safe. No wires, no tricks, no consequences. The plan was to meet Harlow and Joe in person, let them talk, see what they'd say when they thought they were among allies. Grant had agreed to wear a wire, but how do you wire someone at the nude beach? Police fitted him with a recording device hidden inside a car key fob. Small, easy to miss, close enough to pick up a conversation. Grant let the conversation drift naturally. No accusations, no pressure, just questions that sounded normal and curious instead of confrontational. At one point, Sean had said something about Bryan's gory death, and Harlow quickly turned to him and said, "He went quick," as they walked and talked. Joe clammed up, but Harlow started saying things and kept talking. He described being there. He said Bryan never saw it coming. Talked about watching him die, and then almost casually admitted that seeing Bryan go down made him feel better. Like he had gotten revenge on all of the guys who had taken advantage of guys like them in the past. He had a history of abuse in his life. He kind of laughed when he said it. By the time that conversation ended, investigators had exactly what they needed. On May 15th of 2007, Harlow Quadra and Joseph Karakes were arrested back in Virginia. By then, the story had already leaked out enough that the gay porn murder headlines followed immediately, and suddenly, everybody had an opinion. On top of that, the narrative started competing. Harlow said he was innocent. Joe said, "I didn't kill anyone." Each of them suggested that the other was more involved. Their stories didn't line up, and they shifted depending on who was asking the questions and when. Joe's version of that evening was that he had stayed behind, that he never went inside the house, and that he didn't know how bad it would get. Harlow's version changed more. Sometimes he minimized his role. Sometimes he hinted that there was someone else there with them that night. Sometimes he claimed he'd walked into something already in progress. None of it fit together clearly, and they could not get their stories straight. But there was evidence, travel, the purchases, the hotel, the emails, and most damaging of all, the recording from that nude beach in California. Not looking good. Eventually, the pressure broke one of them, as it usually does. And in December of 2008, Joe pleaded guilty. He admitted to second-degree murder along with related charges, and in exchange, he avoided a trial, but not prison. He was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole. Joe accepted responsibility, at least legally. Harlow, however, did not. Harlow chose to go to trial. And when the trial began in February of 2009, it was clear his defense was less about facts and more about performance. He gave off an image of himself as this misunderstood youngster, as someone who was caught up in something bigger than he could control. They reportedly even dressed him in oversized suits to make him seem smaller and weaker. But if you saw what was underneath, you'd know he could easily overpower a man. Once he was on the stand, though, things unraveled. Prosecutors played the tape. They walked the jury through the timeline, step by step, every single contradiction. Every shift in Harlow's story, every moment where his own words boxed him in. The confidence he'd shown on the beach in California didn't translate well in a courtroom. By the end, there wasn't much room left to spin things around. In March of 2009, the jury found Harlow Quadra guilty of first-degree murder. The sentence was mandatory life in prison without the possibility of parole. With that, the criminal case was over. The rest of the world moved on. Cobra Video, however, didn't. After Brian's death, it basically froze in time. The website stayed up, titles stayed online, but no new films were ever made. No reboot, no comeback. It just sat there untouched, like a digital time capsule from a very specific, very dark moment in the industry. And the star of it all, Brent Corrigan, aka Sean Lockhart, moved on too. While working for Pink Media between 2008 and 2010, he directed 5 gay adult films. He won a Rising Star Award at a film festival and tried to pivot into more mainstream work. He acted in some indie films, took some small roles. He even landed a blink and you miss it part in the film Milk. Over the years, books were written, a movie was made, King Cobra. Great movie, by the way. And the story turned into another cautionary tale about greed, control, and the internet's ability to really fuck things up. And that is the story of the murder of Bryan Kocis. I'll see you next time. And until next time, you better take your time to think before you mess with a determined twink. Goodbye.